All right, good morning, Title I coordinators. Thank you for joining us today for our October webinar. I will pull our slides up right now. There we go. If you're new to Title I webinars, I'm Erin Sudduth, and I'm the Title I Part A Support and Improvement Branch Manager. If you have any questions or comments during the webinar, those of you joining us through Teams can put those in the chat, or if you want to use the raise hand feature at the end when we ask for questions and then unmute yourself, you can do that. Those of you joining through the media portal can also just send me an email to erin.sudduth@education.ky.gov. And as always, we will post this recording and the PowerPoint on our Documents and Resources webpage probably later today or sometime tomorrow. A recap from our September webinar, we talked about the User Access Administrator role in GMAP and the importance of having more than one person assigned to that role. We also talked about paraeducator qualification requirements, and our main focus was, of course, the comparability report. So if you weren't able to join us last month, be sure you go back and watch that recording. Looking at today's agenda, we've got a number of reminders and some announcements. As always, we talk about our newsletter highlights in case you missed any of those articles. I'm going to share information about a new Title I resource that's now available, and our main focus is going to be on the timely spending of funds. First up, our reminders. Of course, we have the 2023-24 comparability report. That is due November 1st. That is next week, so it'll be here before you know it. Thank you to all of the districts who've already submitted their reports. I know our consultants are working to review the reports in the order in which they were submitted. And I will be sending out a separate email reminder tomorrow morning to our districts who haven't submitted the report yet. So be sure that you upload that completed report, the Excel workbook, to the district document library within GMAP. And we do ask that you try to use a consistent naming convention for that file. So we put the school year, your district name, and then the abbreviation comp rep. Another reminder is just to check and ensure that any issues that have been identified on your 2024 GMAP application have been addressed and that the application has been resubmitted for approval. If you haven't had a chance to read this month's newsletter, it is posted on our Documents and Resources webpage. We leave all of the newsletters and webinars posted for a year. And if you're not currently subscribed, you can do so through the newsletter. You can just reach out directly to me and I'll get you added to the list. So this month we had a lot of information in there, information about our ESSA waiver request, which was approved by USAID, a comparability report reminder like I just provided. We had an article on supporting gifted and talented students with Title I funds. A reminder that our statewide consolidated monitoring will be here before you know it. Another article about activities for children and how they boost parent and family engagement efforts in a district. And then an announcement about that new Title I resource. So be sure that you are sharing any pertinent newsletter articles with Title I principals or other staff who collaborate on the Title I program. Sometimes we have things in there about students experiencing homelessness, children in foster care, maybe something the finance officer needs to see. And you don't have to be a Title I coordinator to subscribe to the newsletter. That is open to anybody. So in our October newsletter, we did announce a new Title I resource. This is the Title I Part A documentation training webinar and accompanying PowerPoint that is now available on our webpage in the Consolidated Monitoring Documents section. And I'll pull that up in just a minute and show you kind of what that looks like. So this resource was designed to just provide an overview of what we would consider to be effective program documentation for both districts and schools. It is aligned with the sections and the indicators of all of our consolidated monitoring checklists. And there's also some general information about file format, general documentation tips, legal citation, things of that nature. The webinar is about an hour long, and it's a very high-level walkthrough of those monitoring checklist indicators and documentation tips. If you look on the accompanying PowerPoint on, I believe it's slide 3, there are some timestamp references that will allow you to navigate to a specific section of the recording. And we do always recommend using our monitoring checklist as guides for determining what evidence to save at the district and school level. We've done that in past webinars. So be sure that you're not waiting until you are selected for monitoring to watch this webinar. Go ahead and check it out, share it with Title I principals and other staff responsible for program documentation. So let me just kind of pull that up really quick and show you what that looks like. Okay, so this is our Title I Part A Documents and Resources webpage. And if you scroll down here to Consolidated Monitoring Documents, you can see we have all of our checklists here. And then the new addition here is the webinar itself, and then the PowerPoint. And just to give you an idea, here's the basic information. And then we get into each section of the checklist and just a bulleted list, very, like I said, high level overview of the requirements. As I'm pulling our PowerPoint back up, I will share that we are very excited. We are working with a company called PCG, and we're going to begin providing some more information about some more opportunities to support you in your program documentation efforts. So you'll be getting some information, some emails and items in the newsletter, things like that in the coming weeks and months. So be sure that you are on the lookout for that. We're really excited to provide you with this resource and support. So moving on to the main focus of today's webinars, the importance of spending your funds in a timely fashion. And if you remember our April webinar, we did a really deep dive into the Title I Part A carryover limitation. So we're not going to go through all of that again. If you didn't join us for that one, be sure you go back and watch it. It was very important. But before we get started today, I do want to just give you some general reminders about the timely spending of funds. So Title I Part A has a 27-month period of performance. We've got that initial grant period, which is 15 months, and then we have the tidings period, which is an additional 12 months. So if you look at the table there on the right, using the current school year as an example, the funds became available for obligation on July 1st, 2023. Of course, once your application has been approved, that's when you can start obligating those funds. And then the period of performance will end on September 30th, 2025. So that initial grant period is going to be July 1st, 2023 through September 30th of 2024, 15 months. And then that tidings period is going to be October 1st of 2024 through September 30th of 2025. And districts do need to ensure that at least 85% of funds are obligated for activities that occur during the initial grant period between July 1st of this year and September 30th of next year. And that is required under Section 1127A of ESSA. And another quick reminder is just that when we say the word obligation, we are referring to spending or encumbering funds. Now, this slide probably looks familiar. This was shared in the April webinar, and I've updated it to include the waiver that we recently received for school year 22-23 funds. That's Project J. So USAID granted a waiver of that carryover limitation requirement for everybody, all states, for the 1920 school year as a result of COVID. And then KDE requested and received additional, I guess that should say, no, that is right, 3 additional school years. And this allowed KDE to grant a district's carryover waiver request more than once in a 3-year period. So I want to point out that the waivers that we got from USAID did not mean that districts didn't still need to contact KDE and say, we're going to carry over more than 15%, we need to request a waiver. The waiver meant that the district could request the waiver more than once in a 3-year period. So if you maybe misunderstood that this last time around and you need to request one for 22-23 funds, you can still do that. And the instructions for doing that are in our September newsletter. And again, this slide is a repeat from the April webinar, just with an update for those Project J funds. This has the state fiscal year, the corresponding school year, and when the district will be eligible for another carryover waiver. And that's the column that I want to focus on, that far right column. So the past few years have definitely looked very different post-COVID, but we know that we're kind of moving back to normal or new normal, whatever you want to call it. The waivers to the carryover limitation will end at some point. So districts really need to be prepared for that. You need to be operating under the assumption that that once every 3 years limitation will be in effect for Project 310K funds, the 23-24 school year funds. So if you look at the column on the right, if that 3-year once every 3 years limitation is back into effect beginning next year, here is when districts would be eligible to request another carryover waiver based on their most recently requested one. So for example, if you requested and received a waiver for last year's funds, you would not be eligible for another waiver until September of 2026. And remember that districts who are ineligible for a carryover waiver, meaning they've requested one more than once in the past 3 years, and exceed the 15% carryover limitation, will have their allocation reduced by the exact amount of excess carryover. So for example, if you aren't eligible for a waiver and you're allowed to carry over $100,000, but you carry over $115,000, then your allocation is supposed to be reduced by $15,000. That's how much over you were. And that's required by ESSA 1126C. And again, just go back and watch that April webinar for a much more detailed explanation of that. So when we think about spending down previous year's funds, it's important to work with the finance officer to make some determinations. First of all, what is the amount of unobligated funds for all of our open projects, anything that has not been spent or encumbered? And then you need to figure out if there are any upcoming expenditures that are going to impact that remaining balance. For example, staffing costs. So you might need to work with your finance officer to kind of extrapolate a timeline of sorts for when funds will be spent on staffing. You also want to make sure that all of your schools are spending their funds in a timely fashion, as well as in line with their Title I plan and their CSIP. So are there any object codes where funds have been budgeted for maybe some sort of service or materials, and those things just didn't come to fruition? For example, maybe there was a staff position that the school wasn't able to fill, or some supplies came in really under budget, or you wanted to do some professional development, some travel expenses, and it just didn't happen. In that case, it may be necessary to take a look at that and figure out where we can move those funds to spend them and make sure that we're still spending down in accordance with the period of performance. We also need to look at the funds for required reservations. So for everybody, that's going to include your homeless set aside. And then for districts with participating private schools, that's going to include the funds for equitable services. And for our districts with allocations of $500,000 or more who are required to reserve parent and family engagement funds, that's also going to include those. We want to make sure that those are being spent, and they are intended to be spent during the school year in which they are generated. Any funds that remain at the end of the school year must still be spent for that same purpose. So you want to be sure you're working with your finance officer, go in and check Munis to ensure that no funds have been moved from these required reservations and spent somewhere else. So if you had leftover homeless funds at the end of the year, That's still spent on homeless. We don't go back in and move those and spend those elsewhere. And that is another thing that we check during monitoring and can result in a finding. It's also important to develop a plan that will allow you to spend down your previous year's funds and spend the current year's funds in a timely fashion. You don't want to kind of get yourself in a hole there. It would be pretty easy to do. When we think about obligating current year funds, first of all, we want to follow the district's written process for monitoring the expenditure of funds. That is one of the documents that KDE reviews during monitoring. So if you haven't created that written process yet, or maybe you have one, but it really doesn't have any specific details about how your district obligates those funds and makes sure that they're being spent the way that they should be, I recommend looking at our carryover information document. It has some guiding questions and general information that can really help you develop your own set of a written process or written procedures for that. And be sure that you can also document that that process is being implemented with fidelity. So for example, let's say that your process says principals at Title I schools will receive updated remaining balances at the monthly Title I meeting, or they'll be sent out via email, something like that. Then you should have record of those emails, or you should have meeting minutes from those monthly meetings showing that that information was shared with the principals. Couple practices to consider maybe incorporating into your written process. First up, reviewing the district balances spreadsheet that is sent by KDE. This comes from the KDE budget office, and this reflects the funds that have been drawn down by the district as opposed to funds which have been obligated, such as funds that have been encumbered, but the expense hasn't come through yet. There could also be expenditures that the district has already paid out, but they just haven't submitted that request to get the reimbursement from KDE. So it's not a perfect system to look at, but it does give you kind of a general idea of where you're at with your spend down. That being said, when I looked at the October 13th spreadsheet, I did notice that there were a number of districts who have drawn down less than 85% of their funds, but didn't request a carryover waiver. Now, of course, like I just said, you could have encumbrances, you could have things you just haven't submitted to KDE yet that helped you meet that 85%, but be sure that you work with your finance officer to review the percentage of 310J funds that had been obligated as of September 30th of this year. If that was less than 85%, and you didn't request a carryover waiver, you need to go ahead and request that now. And as I said a moment ago, that is in our September newsletter, the instructions for doing that. Another thing you might want to consider doing is developing some sort of obligation timeline, which provides kind of some approximate target dates to have a certain percentage of funds obligated. And I do know there are at least a couple of districts who kind of do this with their schools, and our next slides are going to have some more information about what that might look like. So first of all, I want to say there's not a legal requirement to obligate a certain percentage or amount of funds each month. However, developing some sort of general guideline might just help you ensure that you're on track to meet the carryover limitation. So remember that not spending your funds in a timely manner can be seen as a risk for several reasons. So during that April webinar, when we took a close look at all things carryover, we discussed how Title I funds are intended to be spent on the current needs of identified students, and that when Congress appropriates funds, they expect them to be spent. So if funds aren't being spent in a timely manner, it could kind of raise some questions as to whether or not the funds are being spent to address current needs. You also want to keep in mind that your improvement plans, your CSIP, your CDIP, serve as your Title I program plans. So if funds aren't being spent throughout the year on those identified initiatives, it may indicate that the district or school is not following their Title I plan. So as we said at the beginning, 85% of funds must be obligated in the first 15 months of the period of performance. So all I did to get this general guideline was just divide 85% by 15 months, and it's about 5.66% each month. Now, the amount of funds that are obligated each month are going to fluctuate. That's why I said this is not any sort of requirement. This is just a very general guideline. You might want to outline some next steps in your written process if the district or an individual school has obligated significantly less than that targeted percentage. We'll kind of see what that looks like here. So these are the approximate target dates, just using that very general guideline of 5.66% obligated each month. So we've got the percentage which theoretically should be obligated each month. And again, these are very general amounts, very approximate. So I want to kind of talk about what this slide is saying and what it's not saying. So the table indicates, for example, that by December, the end of December, approximately 34% of funds should have been obligated. Now, does that mean that if you go in and you check Munis and you see that only 30% has been obligated, that you panic? Absolutely not. Now, if you go in and you check Munis at the end of December and you see that only 5% has been obligated, then you probably want to do a little bit of digging, look at this with your finance officer and see if anything has been overlooked. Maybe there was an expenditure that was accidentally charged to the wrong project. Or maybe there are some really large expenditures that you know are going to be coming through in January that are really going to put you back on track, so to speak. Incorporating this type of regular review into your existing process allows you to recognize and address issues as soon as possible. And incorporating something like this into your written process is just one possible way of monitoring the expenditure of funds. You absolutely do not have to do this. It's just a suggestion. You need to be sure you consider what will work for your district and your schools and develop a process that you have the capacity to implement. All right, so let's see if we have any questions about that. I don't see any in the chat yet. And let me check the email. I don't see any right now, but we'll check again before we sign off. I have a couple of announcements I want to share with you. All of the Title I coordinators should have received an email from me last week on the 16th regarding the 2024 National ESEA Conference. We'd heard from several of you earlier this year asking if KDE was going to be paying for districts to attend that again, as we did last year. We are once again offering to pay for up to 2 registrations per district to attend the conference. You can either attend virtually or in person in Portland, Oregon. And the conference is February 7th through the 10th. I do want to point out that if you wish to attend in person, KDE is paying for your registration costs. The district is going to be responsible for covering any travel expenses, airfare, taxi, lodging, meal reimbursement, all of that. And we are only paying for up to 2 people per district. If you want to send more than that, you're welcome to do that, but you'll need to cover that expense yourself. Be sure to complete the interest survey that was included in that email. I also included it in the email that I sent out right before the webinar. That needs to be completed by November 3rd. And Erica's just dropped a link to that in the Teams chat for those of you joining us via Teams. It's important to have it done by that deadline because we need to start confirming with people that they do want to attend and then submitting the travel request forms that we have to do on our end to be able to pay for it. So if you don't complete it by the 3rd, there's not going to be an option to reach out to us later and be added to that because it takes kind of a while to get approval, as I'm sure you know from your experience in the district. So just one last reminder, be sure that you check that percentage of funds that was obligated as of September 30th to ensure that you don't need to reach out to us and request a carryover waiver for 310J funds. All right, I'll do a last check for questions. All right, I am not seeing any, so thank you all for joining us. And oh, I forgot to tell you the next webinar dates. Our next webinar is going to be Thursday, November 16th at 10 a.m. Eastern, as always. Thank you for joining us, and we will see you next time.